The two things that stick in my mind when you're saying that were, one, my dad and walking out of a lot of family gatherings. My dad was, people think most people of German descent have to be right-wing Nazis, but there's a very liberal socialist strain in Germany too, and my dad was of that. My dad was a very open-minded person. He worked with blacks and Puerto Ricans when he worked at the New York City Health Department, driving a van. I remember driving along with him in the early 1970s during the sickle cell anemia crisis, which, if anyone knows, black people and Mediterranean people too are more prone to their red blood cell. I believe it's the red blood cells turning sickle-like rather than being circular, which makes it more difficult to pass into smaller veins and arteries in the extremities. And this was a big crisis in the early 70s in New York City, especially. So my dad was very in touch with stuff. And the other thing that came to mind was you. And I remember over the years seeing your sort of panoply of different colored girlfriends and whatnot. And I remember thinking when we first met, I said, damn, I wish I had grown up 20 years later, because if I had tried to bring home any of the girls basically that you were interested in, they would have been raped, I would have been killed, or both of us would have been killed, because I was the closest I could come to was maybe a light-skinned Latina girl if I had the hots for. But anyway, those are the two things. My dad's constant battles with his own family, which were Long Island Republicans, who would probably be considered liberal Republicans if there is such a thing still. But nonetheless, my dad walking out talking about when my family would talk about Dr. Martin Luther King, and then the limited supply of females, which would have enhanced my life had I been born 20 years later.
Yeah. So in your books, you sometimes talk about, I'm not sure if this is a pseudonym or what, you talk about this girl, Simone Francis, right? That you were interested in, but you couldn't date her because she was black. So like, just to stay on that for a second. So your experiences then were, interracial dating was very much frowned upon. By the time that I was in high school, there was like nobody cared at all, right? In fact, like even like walking down the street with a black or whoever, even in a black neighborhood, like I've never felt any kind of hostility, right? That wasn't really part of my life. And
let me just one thing. When I've been on Facebook and I'm in groups like Long Island Memories, Queens Memories, Ridgewood, Glendale Memories, which are neighborhoods in Queens, which is part of Long Island. There are people that I know that are some of my Facebook friends, and other people, they'll talk about, oh, I grew up as Beaver Cleaver and this, and everything was wonderful. And I remember just recently, a few weeks ago, I got kicked out of a group because I said, you're living in a fantasy. I said, the 1970s in New York were far more taxi drivers than they were Beaver Cleaver. And, and I know that it's bullshit, because even some of the people who I still am in contact with on Facebook, they'll write things in their posts about things we had in common, where we worked or I knew. And I'm like, I don't understand where these people get it. They'll talk about the 104th precinct and everyone respected the cops. What are you talking about? Mm-hmm. I remember. I'm old enough to remember when the dirty immigrants weren't Hispanics, but were Slavs who worked in the knitting mills along the Brooklyn-Queens border. And when the cops used to come in, and they would, and I even wrote about, I think in my True Life memoir, about cops who killed a Slavic waiter and accidentally when they were harassing a restaurant, and they covered that up. And this was all from the 104th precinct. And I talked about the 104th precinct, how I was one time this Hispanic woman who was a drug addict was stealing some meat, and two cops finger fucked her in the car while I was driving with them to fill out the report for the company I worked for. This is the kind of over-the-top stuff that cops would get away with, not to mention the harassment of the general harassment of blacks. When the neighborhood I lived in on 79th Place in Glendale, there used to be factories in this place called Atlas Terminal, which was this mobbed up place. And there would be black janitors who'd sometimes have to walk just 2 or 3 blocks from the terminal to catch a bus to go to Jamaica. Mm-hmm. And I remember little old ladies coming or ringing the bell, and you'd open the door and say, I can't say, I'm not going to say the N word. There's an N word in the neighborhood. Did you see what they're doing? And you'd see these guys, they come out of the little deli that was there, and they'd have, a can of beer or a sandwich that they bought. And it's like, they're walking through the neighborhood. Pass it on, lock your door. And it's like, these are middle-aged guys who are coming off of an 8-hour or 10-hour shift. They got pot bellies. They wanted to get out of there. Or when I went to junior high school 119, there was this kid. His name was Danny Price. That was his real name. He and another black kid were beaten. A van pulled up. These guys who were 2 or 3 years older who could drive beat the crap out of them with bats and water. I never saw Danny or his friend again. They did survive. This was long before these things even became like the famous incidents in Howard Beach and Bensonhurst in the 80s or stuff. It was just buried on page 47. 2 young children in the Glendale neighborhood were walking to the bus stop and were beaten to death. Boom. 3 sentences, and it was accepted that this was just what they had to deal with. And I I knew the kid who actually did it. He's dead now, and I'm happy because he was a son of a bitch. And I smiled when I saw the Facebook. But of course, these people would say, "Oh, he was a child of God," and what? No, I knew him as a fucking asshole bigot who beat this kid that was my friend in junior high school nearly to death with a bat simply because of the color of his skin. And yet, and my one vengeance against him was when I was working for this mob. I guess you call it this mob place in their warehouse. This guy came to apply for a job, and I told him about this kid who was bragging about this, about beating this black kid nearly to death. These 2 black kids, him and his friends, and the gangsters had some people beat the shit out of him simply because of his being a squealer. And it's interesting because these gangsters who I saw do many things of violence against black people who happened to cross the Brooklyn-Queens border, with their bizarre sense of honor was that this kid was so stupid in talking about what he did in beating the black guy that they beat him just on their own bizarre principle. But anyway, that's getting off topic.